When it comes to topics like censorship in video games, it's often a pretty heated debate. Every year or so, there's always some sort of story that makes major headlines when a video game is censored in one way or another, whether it's the developers choosing or a publisher wanting that to be done, or maybe it's a bigger group voicing a concern about material left in a video game. And Halo, while they don't have the longest and most scrutinized track record of censorship within their franchise, still has a history nonetheless, with interesting decisions that had been made or interesting stories within the entire franchise where some things were altered, censored, or changed throughout the years, mostly in an attempt to avoid as much controversy as possible. So we wanted to take a look at some of these moments that were deemed too controversial for an official release, take a look at what they originally were and why they were bypassed, and maybe compare it to some instances that are still in Halo that ended up not getting revised or bypassed later on. But before we jump into it, we want to tell you guys about today's sponsor, Hero Wars. Hero Wars is a fantasy online action RPG game with many PvE and PvP modes played by more than 100 million players from all over the world. You can play the campaign that has over 130 missions, immerse yourself in the story, kill bosses, and discover new heroes. There are currently more than 50 heroes, with each having their own unique abilities and skills, and the fun really begins when you get to figure out the best combinations of heroes that work for you, and you can come up with your own strategies with your team. Between 6 different game modes available, we personally really like the Tower and Grand Arena mode, as the Tower mode has multiple floors of enemies you get to fight through every day, and Grand Arena is an interesting spin of a classic arena gameplay that puts you in a best out of 3 against 2 other teams. Join the game now and get a super chest with a secret hero, as well as 600 emeralds and 30,000 gold. Scan this QR code or download the game from the link below in the video. Okay, let's go ahead and jump back into the video. So let's start by easing into things instead of just going straight into some of the wild and wacky censorships that's happened over the years. But one thing that is really interesting is the Halo engine itself, the engine that has been used in every Halo game since Halo 1, even though obviously each iteration of the franchise has evolved and changed the engine in one way or another, was originally referred to as the Blam engine internally at Bungie. Nowadays, this engine has been renamed to things like the Halo engine or the Slipspace engine, but at its roots, it was referred to as the Blam engine. And this actually comes from an old ongoing joke at Bungie as a form of censorship of text within their video games. Actually, at one point of development in Combat Evolved, Blam was even the working title for Halo Combat Evolved, which apparently became the working title because before it was called Blam, it was called Monkey Nuts, and Jason Jones, who was the project lead, couldn't bring himself to tell his mother that he was working on a game called that. So he went with the word Blam, and that became the working title until they settled on Halo Combat Evolved. From that moment forward, Blam kind of became the de facto replacement for any type of swear word internally at Bungie. For instance, in Bungie's other game, Oni, if the game crashed, a pop-up would show up saying, "Blam, Oni crashed." More popularly on Bungie.net, if there was a swear word somewhere in a quote or just in a discussion, it would be replaced with the word Blam. And in Halo 3, when players were finally able to name their own maps and game types, if they used a word or phrase that was deemed inappropriate, it would be replaced by Blam with the exclamation mark. Now, there were some occasional glitches that would cause the naming to be corrupted of a map, and it also seemed like the default name for any map before it was relabeled by Halo 3 would also revert to the word Blam as well. In the book, The Art of Halo, allegedly way back when the Bungie team was still working out of Chicago in a building near a busy street, occasionally they would hear cars screeching, and Bungie artist and writer Robert McLeese would occasionally yell out Blam so that there was a sense of completion to the screeching noise that may have not ended up in an actual car collision, and I guess from there it just became this big ongoing gag. But there is still speculation that Blam may have had roots even earlier in Bungie history as a README file for the Bungie game Minotaur, where in this text Jason Jones utters the final words Blam. And to this day though, Blam still exists in various forms of media within Halo, but also in Destiny 2, within clan chats and some places on Bungie's website. Blam still will be used as a filter word if a profanity filter is enabled. And while we're on the topic of profanity filters, one thing that is very interesting is the Master Chief Collection's implementation of a profanity filter in text chat in-game. While a lot of games out there have some level of profanity filters in global chat, it does seem like MCC's has always had this reputation of having an overly aggressive profanity filter, with some Halo fans actually drawing comparisons to things that you can say in Roblox, but not in Halo MCC, which is kind of drastic. I mean, I get it, there was a problem with profanity just being very aggressive on MCC, and I think they flipped the switch maybe a little bit too high. There was a period of time when this was all being implemented where even certain classic game types from the old school Halo 3 days were being censored. For instance, the very popular custom game Fat Kid was actively censored, and anyone who had game types saved of Fat Kid would see it renamed to Blam or would have some sort of weird censorship not letting you play the game type. This was eventually fixed, as it definitely was not intended to happen, though some users in the Halo community did manage to come up with some great alternative names for Fat Kid during the downtime, including Rotund Offspring, Massive Youngster, Round Whippersnapper, Overweight Juvenile, Small Big Boy, and Tubby Tot, all as alternatives to the name Fat Kid. It honestly was pretty funny for a while. Out of the entire Halo franchise, Halo 3 ODST actually seems to have a pretty significant amount of changes over the years, from its original release in 2009 through its releases in MCC and the PC version of MCC. Now, a lot of people probably already know this one, but all the way back in 2009, there were little subtle references to Destiny put in Halo 3 ODST, which at the time nobody realized was the next big Bungie game that Bungie had been working on. When ODST did come to the Master Chief Collection though, these posters were switched out, and the Destiny references were removed from the game. There hasn't ever been an exact explanation as to what the decision was to try to distance Halo at that time in 2014, 2015 from Bungie, but it did seem very apparent to be something that they wanted to do during that time, wasn't really deemed as a big deal later on, because when Halo Reach later came to the Master Chief Collection in 2019, these Halo Reach posters in reference to Destiny still remained up in the game. Actually, it's really weird because it seems like ODST specifically was censored more than the rest of MCC across the board back when ODST was added into MCC. For instance, this popular Easter egg that was featured in Kikowani Station in Halo 3 ODST had Marty O'Donnell and Siege of Madrigal playing right here, and for whatever reason, this specific Marty Easter egg was removed from the game and replaced with the Beamish Frank O'Connor Easter egg. Now, mind you, during the time of Halo 3 ODST's release in MCC in 2015, it was right after Marty was fired from Bungie, which led into this huge legal suit that Marty ended up winning. But it seems like maybe when this whole dispute was going on, 343 just wanted to keep their hands clean of it and just kept any reference to Bungie, Destiny, and Marty O'Donnell out of Halo 3 ODST, because this obviously wasn't the case beforehand, because there's various Easter eggs referencing Marty O'Donnell in the other Halo games that are featured in MCC that had released months before this whole thing went down. So it is interesting to take note that this is a very specific instance of censorship rather than just a general thing chosen for MCC. Interestingly enough though, Halo 3 ODST would be hit with more censorship when it finally was added to the Master Chief Collection in 2020 for PC players, which also included an update on the Xbox version to coincide with the new season's release. And with the ODST season coming in September of 2020, this was also during a time where there was a lot of racial and social unrest around the world, and during the flighting of Halo 3 ODST, it was uncovered that there was a police lights inspired nameplate that would be included in Halo the Master Chief Collection as a part of the ODST season to coincide with the new Mombasa Police Department from Halo, which is a setting in the campaign of ODST. When a user on Twitter ended up sharing that that was included in the flight, and as more people within the Halo community saw it, some fans pointed out that the inclusion of that nameplate in that specific time period was a little bit insensitive. I don't think there was really too many people who thought that the nameplate was a big political statement or anything, and that the intentions of the nameplate were in fact just to be a nameplate inspired by the atmosphere of the streets of New Mombasa in ODST. But obviously, since the nameplate would be reaching more people than just ODST itself, as it was a part of the Halo Master Chief Collection, 343 quickly made a response and elected to remove the nameplate from the final release of ODST, just so no one thought that it was trying to send across a specific political message. Now, this change did get some publicity, and there were news articles and news outlets reporting on this. However, after all of this stuff happened, it seemed like 343 took a closer look at ODST itself and made a couple other smaller tweaks within the game itself that not that many people actually talk about. For instance, early in ODST, there's graffiti on this wall that says "You loot, I shoot," which ended up being removed from that same MCC update and PC release of the game, as this graffiti, even though it was originally included in 2009, did have similarities to a tweet by Donald Trump in May earlier that year that was pretty controversial. And as that phrase was becoming more of a talking point in the public eye, it was revealed to many people that there is a racially charged history behind the phrase "when the looting starts, the shooting starts." After the tweet, Twitter stepped in and ended up limiting the public's ability to view the tweet, and Donald Trump made a statement that he didn't know about the racially charged history behind the phrase when he tweeted it. And at the end of all of this, the phrase in ODST also ended up getting removed from the graffiti and was replaced with other graffiti that is found alongside the streets of New Mombasa. Though if you play on the original ODST via backwards compatibility or on a 360, the original graffiti is still found in that version. Now, there is a really interesting conversation that can happen from the perspective of questioning whether there should be changes to forms of art, specifically video games even, and whether or not steps should be made to change a game to remain appropriate within a modern social climate or to avoid controversy like what we saw with Marty O'Donnell, or should a game be left alone in a preservational state where we can decide for ourselves what holds up and what doesn't. For instance, with this type of censorship where they thought taking Marty O'Donnell out of one Easter egg or removing graffiti to be more appropriate to modern times, it's obvious that the approach here was to kind of shape MCC into being a game that avoids controversial topics and tries to be inclusive. But then with that approach, sometimes you're playing through MCC and you catch something and it makes you wonder, should this have still been left in the game with the approach that they are taking with MCC? Like, for instance, on Halo 2, on the level Foundation, has the description saying, "Deep in Chicago Industrial Zone 8 lies the decommissioned tactical autonomous robotic defense system testing facility." Now, with each letter capitalized, it's obviously an acronym that spells out part of a word that obviously was a silly inside joke all the way back in 2004. I mean, definitely back when this text was written in 2004 for Halo 2, this word wasn't widely recognized as a problematic word, nor was there likely any ill will intended. And nowadays, I think a lot of people strive to be less ignorant of words that can really hurt some people, and I don't have any problem with it being the flair text still in the game. I just think it's surprising that they never caught that in the MCC releases, considering the amount of heavy censorship that was used in other areas like in ODST. I'm not calling for the removal of some text, I'm just saying the game should be consistent across the board in either allowing Halo to exist as a time capsule for what the games were when they originally released, or is modern day MCC supposed to take into consideration these types of social issues and act on them by retroactively changing things in their games while leaving the original Halo games intact. And on that note, I think we should switch gears and talk about ass for a second. After the release of Halo 2 in 2004, Microsoft brought on the development team Hired Gun to begin working on a port of Halo 2 for Windows Vista. However, when the game finally did release in 2007, a lot of Halo fans jumped into Halo 2 Vista and started going through the files looking for any form of cut content or new content that hadn't been discovered before, because players could finally actually just look at the Halo files on their computer much easier. And deep in the files, there was an error report file type called .as, which existed from all the way back in the Bungie days as an internal tool whenever they were trying to generate .scenario and .scenario structure BSP files. If there was a problem with that, then internally the error report would pop up, which included a joke that they had put in where engineer Charlie Go was mooning Steve Ballmer in a picture. Now, obviously, essentially, this was never intended for consumers to see it. It was something in an error file in Halo 2, something that would never show up on an Xbox. However, it was something that was missed by the development team who was porting the files over for the PC version, which wasn't discovered until after the game went gold, and fans were able to discover this in the files, which then ended up resulting in Microsoft self-reporting themselves to ESRB, and then a bunch of stickers had to be printed out and put over the label of the Halo 2 Vista box for the initial set of games that were released. A patch later came out obviously removing this, and all copies of Halo 2 Vista after that initial short run were updated as well. And through various interviews over the years after this incident, it seemed like Microsoft definitely cracked down on Bungie for this, even though it really wasn't their fault. I mean, they probably shouldn't have done that in the first place. But still, and allegedly, the process of adding Easter eggs into all future Halo games had to kind of go through a little bit of an approval process before just sprinkling things in freely like they could with Combat Evolved in Halo 2. But yeah, I can only imagine the surprise of the Bungie employees when this ended up becoming a thing, because this was something obviously that was made way back in the development period of Halo 2. And then, you know, Halo 2's off your mind after its release, and then 2007, it pops up and is this huge controversy. Yeah, I can see it being just a little bit weird. Also, some of you may already know this, but originally the Arbiter in Halo 2 was supposed to be called Dervish. However, at the last minute, Microsoft's legal team approached Bungie and told them that it wasn't a good idea to use that name, and they ended up having to re-record a bunch of lines with the Arbiter instead. And in Vice's The Complete Untold History of Halo, which is this very interesting typed up complete oral history of Halo, designer Jamie Griesemer said, quote, "I think the first conversation I had about Halo 2 was with Joe about story ideas. That was when the idea of playing as Dervish, later called the Arbiter, came up, to see the Covenant from another side. For 97% of the game's development, the Arbiter was the Dervish. I'm going to be careful here because I don't remember all the details, but that name refers to a special set-apart role in the religion of Islam, a kind of holy warrior. So it really fit the idea of this distinguished, extremely powerful, almost blessed by the gods warrior. But then 9/11 happened right before we shipped Halo, and the tone and atmosphere at the time was very complicated, especially when it came to Islam. At the last minute, somebody in legal said we couldn't use Dervish, and half of it was like we shouldn't appropriate somebody else's religious beliefs for some goofy sci-fi game, and part was we don't want to antagonize anyone. It was a really complicated mix, and we just said okay. It also seems like Microsoft was worried that Dervish would set up this allegory of the United States-like forces with Master Chief and the rest of the UNSC going against Islam, where the Covenant already had a character called the Prophet of Truth, which is one of the titles in Islam for Muhammad. It's a rumor to this day that some manuals of Halo 2 even shipped referring to the Arbiter as the Dervish. However, I haven't been able to find any images of this actually existing, so it is possible this was all pulled before the game fully went gold. However, if anybody out there actually checks their Halo 2 manual and sees the Dervish, please let me know on Twitter. In Halo the Master Chief Collection that released in China, there's actually a ton of censorship in that version of the game. It's really interesting because in China, to pass a game, there's a lot of restrictions. As if I'm understanding it correctly, for the most public marketplaces, you have to pretty much pass a type of pass-fail for the game. So essentially, there's not different tiers of ratings. It's kind of you either pass the ratings or you don't pass the ratings. This is really interesting just across the board, just because we don't really get to see two versions of the same game just so drastically different in some ways and then not so much in other ways. But for instance, one big censorship typically happens around the Flood and everything related to the Flood, whether it's this Halo 2 anniversary cutscene that, interestingly enough, cuts the camera to different angles to not show too much of the Gravemind itself, or just the way that some of the Flood human forms look. There's definitely some pretty massive differences. In the level Keyes in Combat Evolved, Keyes' face looks very much censored in Combat Evolved Anniversary compared to the actual version in MCC. And also, when you kill any enemy, in general, the enemies will despawn, whether it's the Flood just shrinking altogether, or in a different Halo game, sometimes the Covenant just phases out of reality. There also seems to be some differences between how blood is handled, where shooting a human has close to no blood at all, and then you can see some alien blood, but it doesn't like splatter at all. There's nothing left over. And so it's just interesting to note that there are these differences. It is kind of funny also to see the enemies either shrink or disappear. MCC probably didn't sell very well in China because it seems like support of this game completely dropped off. It's still running a very primitive version of MCC with a lot of bugs and glitches still intact. But yeah, this is definitely one of the most overt and obvious forms of censorship in Halo over the years. Now, as there's been more iterations of Halo and just things changing, they have changed some of the terminology in the Halo games themselves as well, specifically with Halo Infinite. A lot of you may notice that SWAT had been renamed to Tactical Slayer, likely to either coincide with some of the same social issues that ODST had its alterations for, but it is also possible that it could just be because of the connotation of the term swatting and something that happens to a lot of Twitch streamers, and maybe they just want to stray away from using that word. Another word I didn't realize was changed in Halo Infinite was actually suicide, which is no longer the term used. They actually replaced it with self-destruction. Also, just a minor and very insignificant one. In the book Fall of Reach, Jacob Keyes and Catherine Halsey both wake up at the same time from their cryosleep, and they're both naked. However, in the comics and book adaptations, this is changed where Keyes wakes up and Halsey has already been awake and he's wearing clothes. 343 just ruining our headcanon. So these are definitely some of the more interesting forms of censorship in the Halo universe that we know of so far, and there's probably some more out there that we couldn't fully get to in this video. But if you enjoyed this video and deep dives into the Halo universe, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on for more videos like this. That's it for today. We'll see you all next time with a brand new video.